Afternoon, guys. I am back with our Paddington for the day. Oh, remember when we stopped? He had his hat pulled over his eyes so he couldn't see, and he thought everything had gone black, but it really hadn't. And he made it into a store, and I think that he had a crash. The display that they had up somehow fell on top of him. He must have run into it. So let's see where we are here. For a moment, he wasn't quite sure where he was, and then it came to him. Instead of going out into the street, he must have opened a door leading to one of the shop windows. Paddington was an observant bear, and since he had arrived in London, he noticed lots of these shop windows. They were very interesting. They always had so many things inside them to look at. Once he had seen a man working in one, piling tin cans and boxes on top of each other to make a pyramid. He remembered deciding at the time what a nice job that it must be. He looked round thoughtfully. "Oh dear," he said to the world in general, "I'm in trouble again." If he'd knocked all these things down as he supposed that he must have done, someone was going to be cross. In fact, lots of people were going to be cross. People weren't very good at having things explained to them, and it was going to be difficult explaining how his duffel coat hood had fallen over his head. He bent down and began to pick up the things. There were some glass shelves lying on the floor where they had fallen. It was getting warm inside the window, so he took off his duffel coat and hung it carefully on a nail. Then he picked up a glass shelf and tried balancing it on top of some tins. It seemed to work, so he put some more tins and a washing up bowl on top of that. It was rather wobbly, but he stood back and examined it. Yes, it looked quite nice. There was an encouraging round of applause from outside. Paddington waved a paw at the crowd and picked up another shelf. So Paddington's like in a store window, and he's putting these things back together again, and people are walking by seeing such a cute bear inside a window putting things up. They can't help but to stand there and watch. Inside the shop, Mrs. Brown was having an earnest conversation with the store detective. "You say you left him here, madam," the detective was saying. "That's right," said Mrs. Brown. "He was feeling ill, and I told him not to go away. His name's Paddington." "Paddington," the detective wrote it carefully in his notebook. "What sort of bear is he?" "Oh, he's sort of a golden," said Mrs. Brown. "He was wearing a blue duffel coat and carrying a suitcase, and he has black ears," said Judy. "You can't mistake him." "Black ears," the detective repeated, licking his pencil. "I don't expect that'll help much," said Mrs. Brown. "He was wearing his beret." The detective cupped his hands over his ears. "His what?" he shouted. There really was a terrible noise coming from somewhere. It seemed to be getting worse every minute. Every now and then there was a round of applause, and several times he distinctly heard the sound of people cheering. "His beret!" shouted Mrs. Brown in return, "a green woolen one that came down over his ears with a pom-pom." The detective shut his notebook with a snap. The noise outside was definitely getting worse. "Pardon me," he said sternly. "There's something strange going on that needs investigating." Mrs. Brown and Judy exchanged glances. The same thought was running through both of their minds. They both said, "Paddington!" and rushed after the detective. Mrs. Brown clung to the detective's coat, and Judy clung to Mrs. Brown's as they forced their way through the crowd. On the pavement, just as they reached the window, a tremendous cheer went up. "I might have known," said Mrs. Brown. "Paddington!" exclaimed Judy. Paddington had just reached the top of his pyramid. At least it had started off to be a pyramid, but it wasn't really. It wasn't any particular shape at all, and it was very rickety. Having placed the last tin on the top, Paddington was in trouble. He wanted to get down, but he couldn't. He reached out a paw, and the mountain began to wobble. Paddington clung helplessly to the tin, swaying to and fro. watched by a fascinated audience. And then, without any warning, the whole lot collapsed again. Only this time, Paddington was on top and not underneath. A groan of disappointment went up from the crowd. "Best thing I've ever seen in years," said a man in the crowd to Mrs. Brown. "Blessed if I know how they think these things up." "Will he do it again, Mummy?" asked a small boy. "I don't think so, dear," said his mother. "I think he's finished for the day." She pointed to the window where the detective was removing a sorry-looking Paddington. Mrs. Brown hurried back to the entrance, followed by Judy. Inside the shop, the detective looked at Paddington and then at his notebook. "Blue duffel coat," he said. "Green woolen beret." He pulled the beret off. "Black ears." "I know who you are," he said grimly. "You're Paddington." Paddington nearly fell backwards with astonishment. "However did you know that?" he said. "I'm a detective," said the man. "It's my job to know these things. We're always on the lookout for criminals." "But I'm not a criminal," said Paddington hotly. "I'm a bear. Besides, I was only tidying up the window." "Tidying up the window," the detective spluttered. "I don't know what Mr. Perkins will have to say. He only dressed it this morning." Paddington looked round uneasily. He could see Mrs. Brown and Judy hurrying towards him. In fact, there were several people coming his way, including an important-looking man in a black coat and striped trousers. They all reached him at the same time, and all began talking together. Paddington sat down on his case and watched them. There were times when it was much better to keep quiet, and this was one of them. In the end, it was the important-looking man who won because he had the loudest voice and kept on talking when everyone else had finished. To Paddington's surprise, he reached down, took hold of his paw, and started to shake it so hard he thought it was going to drop off. "Delighted to know you, Bear," he boomed. "Delighted to know you. And congratulations." "That's all right," said Paddington doubtfully. He didn't know why, but the man seemed very pleased. The man turned to Mrs. Brown. "You say his name's Paddington?" "That's right," said Mrs. Brown, "and I'm sure he didn't mean any harm." "Harm?" The man looked at Mrs. Brown in amazement. "Did you say harm? My dear lady, through the action of this bear, we've had the biggest crowd in years. Our telephone hasn't stopped ringing." He waved towards the entrance to the store. "And still they come." He placed his hand on Paddington's head. "Barkridge's," he said. "Barkridge's is grateful." He waved his other hand for silence. "We would like to show our gratitude. If there is anything in the store that you would like." Paddington's eyes gleamed. He knew just what he wanted. He'd seen it on their way up to the outfitting department. It had been standing all by itself on a counter in the food store. The biggest one he'd ever seen, almost as big as himself. "Please," he said, "I'd like one of those jars of marmalade, one of the big ones." If the manager of Barkridge's felt surprised, he didn't show it. He stood respectfully to one side by the entrance to the lift. "Marmalade it shall be," he said, pressing the button. "I think," said Paddington, "if you don't mind, I'd rather use the stairs." Because remember when he was on the lift, which is an elevator, it made his stomach upset the other day. So that's all for Paddington today. Tomorrow we'll be reading Chapter 5, Paddington and the Old Master. I hope you had a good day with your work, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.